This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Katherine Shen. When I say the word teacher, it might conjure up images of or words on a chalkboard, an apple on a desk, and you seated in a classroom in a sea of other students. But teachers enter our lives at every phase: childhood, adolescence, and far into adulthood. And they're not always the people you'd expect. This hour, we're reflecting on life's teachers, those who taught us lessons both in and out of the classroom. I'm joined by an author who spent a long time reflecting on all of the teachers who made her the person she is today. Sarah Ruhl is the author of a new collection of essays called Lessons from My Teachers. Sarah is also a playwright, two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, a Tony Award nominee, and the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship. And her play, Eurydice, is running right now at Signature Theater. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
And for our listeners, tell us about a teacher who changed your life. We would love to hear about it. Leave us a comment on Facebook or Twitter at Where We Live. So, Sarah, I feel like you've had so many lives and are continuing to live those lives with a remarkable career as a playwright and author. What inspired you to turn your attention inward and reflect on the teachers in your life in this book?
There were a couple things. One was a class I teach at Yale called Lessons from My Teachers, and I started teaching the class when I realized I really wanted my students to know there was more than one way into writing a play, and I wanted them to know that I didn't see myself as a guru trying to give them one way in. And so I created this class where I would teach not only the writing of four teachers I had had, but I tried to teach the way they taught so that my students could see, oh, if a visual way doesn't work for me, there's a structural way in. And then at a point, I thought I could expand my notion of teachers and create a book and think about teachers outside of the classroom who had also affected me. And I think it also came from a feeling of dislocation about 5 years ago when there was so much, well, there still is, so much that felt broken about the world. And I was looking for answers on my phone. I found myself turning to my phone and the opinion pages for answers about the good life or to make sense about make sense of politics, my health, spiritual questions. And at a point I thought it would be much better to return to real teachers and the wisdom they've given me and to reflect on that than looking at my phone for answers to these questions.
Well, I feel like there's something really human about that, where pros and cons of technology, but you sort of found your way back to looking into the human beings in your life who has made a difference, and talking about teachers in and out of the classroom. When you were sort of exploring and expanding the notion of that, how did you come to define teacher in the context of this book?
There's so many different teachers I include under this broad umbrella, from my dog, who I think has excellent lessons for humanity, to, a preschool teacher, to an art teacher I had who gave a terrible assignment in my view, to my husband, to my kids, to my mother. So I think one definition I was using, or one reason I had to include teachers, was if I had a story that I could tell. I got really obsessed with the idea of the particular of teaching and the relation and teaching as an exchange, where there was implicit and explicit modeling going on. So in other words, not just a teacher who I'm like, oh my God, that teacher taught me the Odyssey so well, say like that there was a piece of content, but rather looking at the particularity of the relationship, and maybe a moment where I was being offered some kind of wisdom that wasn't necessarily even in the content of what I was supposed to be learning.
And with that sort of experience and leading into writing this book, and as you mentioned earlier, Lessons from My Teachers is based on a playwriting class that you teach at Yale. And in your book's introduction, you write that playwrights are made, not born. Why is it important for your students to internalize that? And how did you kind of get there to that thought?
Well, I think there's so much in the American psyche that teaches artists that they're originals or they're not, and they're sort of legends or they're not. And there's much less focus on practice, learning, lineage. And to me, that's really important because it's a total lie. I think that we just arrive like a comet. There's so many ways we're sculpted, and so many forces that are brought to bear that allow us to be artists. And so I wanted my teachers lessons in my head while I was teaching my students and reminding them that they didn't have to just appear fully formed.
And when you personally got to that thought, was it sort of a gradual experience, or did you have a moment of, oh my God, that's what it is. It's not I'm a legend or not. You build that process.
That's such an interesting question. I don't know if it was one epiphany, but certainly it came to me over the years that I was teaching. And I think most teachers feel like frauds when they start teaching, and I had the voice of Paula Vogel in my head. She was really a hugely impactful teacher for me, and still is, and a dear, dear friend. And I remember the night before I subbed for her class at Yale, which is how I started teaching there. I had a dream that I couldn't speak, that Paula was speaking and I couldn't speak. And I think there was an insecurity that I didn't have my own lessons to give, that I was really just transmitting what Paula had taught me. And I think it took me years to kind of piece together what it is I could give my students, and that, in fact, it did involve lessons that other people had given me.
Well, and then talking about sort of role models, or reminding ourselves that our teachers are also human beings and they were students once. I want to talk about one of the teachers who had a profound impact on your playwriting career, Joyce Piven. First of all, who was Joyce to you, and how did she come into your life?
So Joyce was an amazing acting teacher and a director in Chicago, and she ran a school with her husband Vern called the Piven Theater Workshop. And I took classes there as young as fourth grade. My mom put me in because I was shy, and I think she thought it would help me. Uh, there were a lot of games and story theater, and it taught you to sort of improvise and be in a group. And Joyce, I remember when I first met her, she was trying to teach us the art of transformation, and she transformed herself into this kind of witch figure with nothing but language and her body, and I was stunned. And she became a dear friend and mentor, directed my first professional play, and we lost her this year. She died of pneumonia. And I write about her profound listening and how she also taught a generation of students how to listen. And she really had a gift for listening to sort of the spaces between the words and modeling how listening should not be a performance for actors. You shouldn't be on stage going, I'm listening, you should be listening, and that there's nothing more beautiful to watch on stage and often in life than someone who's really, really listening and not just anticipating what they're going to say next or rehearsing what they're going to say next or judging the speaker, but really taking in what they're saying.
Well, and actually, as I'm listening to you talk about the art of listening, I feel like that's very much in relations to journalism as well. We're here mostly, I think, to listen to what our guests have to say, and then to convey that to our listeners. And I know the art of listening is a reoccurring theme in your book. Can you talk about why this particular lesson really stuck with you, both on stage and in life?
I think you're right. It applies to it applies universally. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
journalists are gifted at the art of listening. My husband's a psychiatrist. He listens to people all day.
There you go.
Yeah, good teachers listen, good directors listen, good parents listen. Um, and I think we're not in a culture of deep listening right now. We're in a culture of looking and
Mm,
reacting. That's social media. You look, you click, you react. Listening is a different art, and you have to allow silence. And when Joyce was in the hospital with pneumonia, her daughter, Shira Piven, who's a wonderful director, was so good at having her students sort of call and say goodbye. And Joyce couldn't speak, but I knew she was listening, and I
mm,
could really feel that. And so I read her this poem. Well, not a poem exactly, but a soliloquy from The Tempest about sort of the art of transformation. It's that section that's these were coral that were his eyes, and it starts 5 fathom deep, my father lies. And I could feel Joyce listening. I trusted that she was listening, and it gave me a lot of peace saying goodbye to her.
mm. Well, and I think with this, the art of listening and the active listening, it kind of goes both ways because I think we all want to be heard, want to be seen, and want to be listened. And in your own work, have you found that being a good listener translates to being a good teacher? Did Joyce help you become a good teacher?
Absolutely. And, Paula Vogel also has an incredible penetrating gaze and ability to listen and to understand what's not being said. Um, for example, when I met Paula, my father had just died. I was 20 and I was having trouble writing. And I remember her looking at me intensely and saying, I think you need to not look at the grief so directly in order to write.
Mm,
And she would give me exercises to kind of not approach things so directly. And I felt like she just had this uncanny, I mean, it's a little, Paul has a little telepathy, a little psychic stuff going on. But part of it is that she's a really good observer and listener. And part of playwriting is the art of observation.
mm,
And, doctors too. Being able to observe patients and listen both to what the patient is saying, but also listen to what they're not saying and what their body is saying. I don't know. Maybe we should replace some useless class at school with a listening class.
I love that you mentioned doctors because we just recently had a conversation with medical officials talking about the importance of listening and what a great sort of live example of this does really penetrate in all aspects of life, not just in art, not just in journalism, but really, if you're in a space where two people are talking, that exists, right? The listening portion.
Yeah, and listening for the unexpected. I had an amazing doctor. His name is Russell Chin. He's a neurologist, and I had unrecovered Bell's palsy, and I'd seen a bunch of doctors. It wasn't getting better, and I told him some story in the diagnosis process where I was like, "Well," he said, "When did it happen?" And I said, "Oh, I had just had twins. The lactation consultant told me to look in the mirror, that my face was frozen." Or that my eye looked, so she said, your eye looks droopy. And I made a joke and said, oh, well, I'm Irish. Um, and and I was just making a joke. And then Russell Chin said, you're Irish. And I said, yeah. And he said, let's test you for celiac disease because it clusters in the Irish population. And sure enough, I had celiac disease. So does my daughter. And he never would have diagnosed it if he hadn't been listening to what I didn't even think was an important detail in the story.
Right. Just more emphasis on how important it is to not just listen, but also say the thing, right? To have the conversation actively. And when we were working on this show and reading through your book, when I think back to teachers who have had a lasting impact on me, I did think about it's not necessarily the topic, But I
Mm,
do remember it was how they taught me more
yeah.
than what they taught me, and their personalities, their enthusiasm that
Mhm.
really struck me. So do you find the same to be true, and why is that?
Well, I have a wonderful friend, Sarah Curtis, who's a kindergarten teacher, and she said to me once, teachers are teaching everything all the time. And what she meant was teachers are not just when, in kindergarten, they're not just reading a book on the rug, they're also teaching how to sit on the rug, how to gather and sit and listen,
I'm not gonna lie, I'm literally picturing myself as a kindergarten student sitting on the rug, and I can still see it.
Totally. And so, like, when I think of Paula Vogel, it wasn't just that she was teaching how to write a play, she was also modeling for me qualities of bravery and generosity and kind of how to make a life in the theater that she wasn't explicitly teaching me, but I watched her do it. Um, I mean, I'm curious for you who those teachers were, if any particular ones pop into your head.
Well, the first person that actually popped into my head as I was reading this was a professor actually in college. He taught medieval lit. And it was an area that I was always interested in. Big fan of like Arthurian legends and all that. But those can be really hard to read because it's
Yeah.
not the same English, right? So it could be kind of like Shakespeare. Big fan, but I totally understand when people don't enjoy it because it's not the same language. And so talking about more the how versus the what, it was
Yeah.
his enthusiasm
Yeah.
that really got me. He was super into it. He's got such a great personality, and for me as a student, that was actually very rare.
Hmm.
Not to burn some of the teachers I've had, but I didn't really come across someone like him as a teacher until I was much older. But that has such a profound impact on me is realizing that you can make any topic or subject or even conversation interesting if you're interested in it. And
Mm.
then his enthusiasm for the topic was tangible. And so I actually wanted to take all of his classes. It didn't really matter what he was teaching, and then I kind of did that. So
What was his name? Do you remember?
oh yeah, it's Professor Michael Hanley. Thanks, Michael. You were great.
Mm.
Shout out.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I feel like, I, I love that app Masterclass just because it's kind of delicious and you can like look at all these famous people teaching. But it removes to me the thing that's almost the most primary thing about teaching, which is the tangible contagion and exchange of knowledge and the relationship. So it actually removes what's most special about teaching, and reduces it to content. Um, so it becomes a one-sided
And
conversation.
yeah, I was looking for the word contagious. So you just said it. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
And so you actually divided your book into three different sections: roots, branches, and flowers, which I think is very beautiful. Can you tell us why you decided to use that particular structure?
Well, I was thinking about the natural world, I guess. And during the pandemic, I started to write one haiku a day, to kind of mark time passing. And so I don't know, I can read maybe a little haiku. Each section has a haiku. So the section Roots has a little poem that goes, does the wind move the trees, or do the trees move the wind? A child might ask, or God. Um, and I guess I just was thinking about my own development and early childhood and, a later kind of maturation and then a kind of flowering later.
Well, and earlier you have talked about the loss of your father, and that was something you shared in the first section of your book. And it struck me that when you were in college, your dad was very interested in what you were learning and how you were developing your worldview. Do you think that's a common experience in that parent-child dynamic? Sometimes the child can become the teacher.
Mm, it's so true. And I think both my parents had a deep curiosity about what I was learning. And there's always been a kind of beautiful exchange I've had with them about books and words. Um, my father used to take me out to breakfast once a week and teach me a new word, and he would try to stump me and pick a really hard word. And then he would tell me the story of the etymology of the word so I could remember the word. Um, and it was the sort of story being attached to the word that made it stick. So, like one example is defunct and peripatetic, and I guess I've been thinking about that because I have a play right now, Eurydice, at Signature Theater, and there's a scene where the father is helping Eurydice sort of relearn her life in the underworld, and he's teaching her these words. So I think parents are often our very first teachers, and we're really lucky if they're excellent, and I was really lucky in my parents.
And you talked about earlier too, where you met some amazing teachers who really helped you get through sort of the grieving process in such a challenging time. Can you talk about that vulnerability and that teacher-student dynamic? Can vulnerability lead to more profound learning?
Hmm. I think so. And I think, I'm from Chicago. My dad was sick. He got sick October of my freshman year. And I stayed at Brown all the way in Providence, even though I was sort of desperate to come home. My father wanted things to seem and feel normal, and he didn't want to sort of ruin what he saw as my adventure. But I think it was only because of these mentors and teachers that I stayed. I think I would have found it impossible had I not found them. One teacher was this classics professor, David Constan, who I lost last year. But David would have students over to his house, and I'll never forget, he cooked an eggplant in the fireplace, and it crackled, and he made baba ganoush out of it. And this was so cosmopolitan to me. Never had I seen homemade baba ganoush, and certainly not in a fireplace. And that it wasn't just he was teaching a class, Ancient Tragedy and Its Influence, which certainly must have influenced me. But it was also being invited into his home and the warmth of that and his sense of humor. And, you know, it, During the pandemic, when we all were on Zoom all the time, again, all of that, you use the word tangible, all of that tangible connection, which is often in the teacher-student relationship, is just so much harder without, a sense of home, the smell of an eggplant, conversation over a meal.
Well, in anticipation for this conversation, we asked some of our colleagues at Connecticut Public to share stories of teachers who have changed their lives. So before we go to break, I want to share what Francesca Fontanez, our Connecticut Public's lead social media editor, shared with us. She said, I had some incredible teachers in my life, but my father had a life changer. I have only seen my dad cry twice, and once was when he was telling me about Mrs. Mullins. He went to Buckley High School in Hartford. His family came from Puerto Rico, so his English wasn't perfect. They were living in the Charter Oak projects, and he frankly wasn't going down a great path. Mrs. Mullins would stay after school with him for hours, just making him complete all his work. When he asked why she was bothering him with this almost weekly ritual, she said she knew he could do his work and wanted to see him succeed, even if he didn't care about his own success at the time. I'm not sure where his life would have gone had she not been there, but I do know that her seeing him and not letting him slip through the cracks is one of the most important turning points of my father's life. I would love Mrs. Mullins to see him now so she could know that one starfish she chose to toss back into the ocean never forgot her kindness. Well, thank you so much, Francesca, for sharing that. Wasn't that beautiful?
Gorgeous.
You've been listening to Sarah Ruhl, who's the author of the new book, Lessons from My Teachers. Sarah is also a playwright, two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, a Tony Award nominee, and also the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Fellowship. More with Sarah after the break. We'll be right back. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Can you think of a teacher who changed your life? What makes them so memorable? Was it what they taught you, or was it how they taught you? This hour, we're exploring the lasting impact of life's teachers. Still with me is Sarah Ruhl. Her collection of essays is called Lessons from My Teacher. So, Sarah, I want to talk about Max here. You mentioned Max in your book. He was your student and had a very profound impact on your life. Can you explain how you met Max?
Sure. Max Ritvo was an astonishing writer, and he took a playwriting class with me at Yale when he was an undergraduate. And I still remember his application to get into the class because he hadn't written a play before. And he said he was a poet and part of an experimental comedy troupe. And I thought, oh, that combination is going to make a glorious play, poetry and comedy.
Mm-hmm.
And Max was an incredibly bright light in the class, very just articulate and imaginative, and had a kind of wild imagination. And then he had a recurrence of Ewing sarcoma that fall, a pediatric cancer he'd had in high school. And I really felt strongly, maybe because of my own experiences with my father when I was at college, that I really wanted to help Max in any way I could when he was still a student. And we got to be friends. And when he graduated Yale and went to Columbia for his MFA in poetry, we got to be even closer friends. And he basically had a very limited time on this earth. He died when he was 24. And he really just wanted to, I think, love as many people as he could, as deeply as he could, and demonstratively as he could with the time that he had. And he wanted to write as much as he could with the time that he had. And all of that was incredibly instructive to me.
Well, and earlier too, we touched a little bit about the vulnerability between teacher and student, and you talked about how there aren't many rituals for the loss of a student or teacher, because as you mentioned, not family, not friends, and yet they are integral to our lives. Can you talk about more how, because it's so hard to define that, why that indefinability struck you after Max's death?
Well, it was such a loss. It was such a loss of a dear friend and a mind that I was in such close dialogue with. And yet I wasn't family. It wasn't like I was going to go to his bedside uh, when he was dying. And I almost felt like I had to finish this book that Max and I were writing, that was a compilation of letters between us, in order to mourn for him, because there weren't sort of just routine channels for mourning. I guess you could say that in general in this culture, secular culture, we're lacking those rituals. It's not just for this particular relationship that we lack them, but I
Right.
think when you lose a partner, say, or your mom, or people tend to know, and they know what to say, and they kind of know what that grief
Mm.
looks like. But I find that the teacher-student relationship is an incredibly profound one, but that we're not sort of used to. Oh, you lost your teacher, that must be really hard for you, or you lost your student, that must be really hard for you.
Well, and Max taught you to tell people you love them now rather than
Mhm.
later. So why do you think it is that we don't tell the teachers and students in our lives what they mean to us in the moment? How much of this goes back to that sense of vulnerability we've been talking about? And of course, this is something that can be applied to almost anywhere in life.
Yeah, I've been reflecting on that a lot, because as I wrote the book, I would send each essay out to each person. And so I felt really lucky that I did that, because I, lost four of the teachers in the course of writing the book, but was able to share the essays with them before they died. And so sometimes the window we think we have to thank people, we think it just extends indefinitely into the future, and it doesn't. Um, so I think that's part of it, that we just think the future extends indefinitely. But in the particular case of teachers, sometimes I think we mythologize them. We think
Mm.
we often meet them as children, so they're very big in our minds, and they're not quite human beings. Like how, when you see a teacher at the grocery store, you're
I
like, oh
was just going to make the same example. It's like they're not real people and they also live in the classroom, right?
yeah, they're not real. So how could we possibly write them and thank them? And so I was also astonished as I wrote the book to see how meaningful it was when teachers heard from me and
Mm.
how rare it was for them to be thanked. I had written to a piano teacher who was really incredible and known in the community, and she wrote to me something like, "Gosh, I never know if I have an effect."
Mm.
And I thought, how could she not know? And I thought, oh, because no one tells her, you know?
Were you surprised by their surprise?
Yeah, in a way, I was. Um, I, I think a lot of people in caretaking professions don't get thanked.
Mm.
I think doctors don't often get thanked, teachers. I think maybe there's also a self-absorption when you're like the receiving vessel,
Mm-hmm.
and so you absorb the lesson or you absorb the care, and you go forward, and you don't think about it.
Mm.
Um, but this was a real lesson for me to make all that explicit and to write and thank people because they appreciate it more than you
Mm.
think.
Well, and I want to ask more about sort of the process of you going back and reliving those moments and reflecting in order to put together this collection of essays. But actually, as you were talking about sort of going back to your teachers and going back to the professor I mentioned earlier, Professor Michael Hanley, who taught medieval lit and got me super interested in all of the things medieval. I reached out to him a couple of times over the course of my career, and the last time I reached out to him was actually during the pandemic lockdown because it was funny for me to see that I think everyone and their grandma was reading Boccaccio, it's Decameron.
Yes.
And I was, of course I would, but I was obsessed with the Decameron as a college student because that was part of the curriculum. And he made it so enjoyable to read those stories. And just for context, it was about a bunch of people during the plague, and they all lived in this one house, and they had to storytell with each other for many, many nights. And I'm, of course, everyone resonated with that at the time of the lockdown. And so when I saw that it was on the bestseller list and it was on back order, I thought, wouldn't it be hilarious if he knew about this? And I assume he did, but I don't know. So I emailed him and just sort of reconnected through that channel. And he responded really quickly and was very excited and grateful to hear from me and the fact that I was still thinking about the crusty old professor, which were his words. And that brought me a lot of joy. And it did serve as a reminder for me, too, that I feel like they do want to hear from you. And maybe if we take a moment to think about them, the joy goes both ways, right? And so going back to the reflecting and the surprise, as you were sort of going back, thinking about your own teachers that have had profound impacts in your life, did you learn anything surprising about yourself in that process?
That's such an interesting question. And by the way, I love what you say about the joy.
Hmm.
The joy goes both ways. That's definitely my experience. And it also just interests me that you reached out in the pandemic because I think another reason we don't reach out is time. That time can be so demanding, and when we're in the midst of things, in the midst of our careers and child rearing or whatever, and the pandemic forced us to stop for a second, and people from the past sort of come back to us when we do that. What did I learn about myself as I was going through? I mean, I think I had a profound sense of gratitude because when I thought about it, I was like, oh my God, I have been just so lucky to have all of these. incredible teachers. And I think another reflection I had was that really anything can be an occasion for learning if you approach it that way, that if you orient yourself as a student, um, it can make a lot of tricky situations seem more approachable, like a moment of anger, irritation. If you think, okay, if I'm approaching this as a student right now, what could I be learning? And that's been helpful to me.
Well, and with that learning in mind too, do you hope that your readers are inspired to reach out to teachers who touched their lives as you were, after reading the book?
I do. That would be such a delightful outcome if that happened. And I have heard from a couple readers who wrote letters to their teachers after reading the book, which makes me so happy.
I think a lot of us here already want to do that right after this conversation. So thank you in advance for that inspiration. And I think, especially since we're talking about connection and how teachers have a profound impact in our lives, I do want to touch on for a second about the value our society places on teachers. And as you mentioned before too, sort of alongside doctors, teaching tends to be a profession with relatively low pay, especially for educators who are just starting out. But yet we do talk about often how important these roles are. Can you share your thoughts on that? How do we square our appreciation for this professional work with the reality that many teachers work second jobs just to make ends meet?
It's outrageous. It's just outrageous. I mean, I think, and during the pandemic too, it was like teachers took on so much extra work and risk, and now they're being asked to carry guns to school in some cases. Just like take a bullet for their children, for their students, and we still aren't valuing them, paying them a living wage. It's to me insane and completely backwards. Yeah, if I were the king of the world, or the king of the forest, or whatever you call it, teachers would be paid the most.
And as we round out this segment, I have another anecdote to share from a Connecticut Public colleague. Sabrina Herrera is the editor of the Latino Initiative here at Connecticut Public, and here's what she shared. Mr. Dawkin was my seventh grade algebra teacher at Greenwich Catholic School. He was nearly 7 feet tall, felt like 12 feet as a middle schooler. Because of his stature, resting scowl face, and booming deep voice, he was scary. Our whole grade was terrified of him. Our algebra class was super quiet, and still on that first day of class, so much so that he noticed and asked if we were all okay. He became one of my favorite teachers. Him and his wife, Miss Dawkin, who was the librarian, taught us lessons far beyond the classroom. They encouraged us to make choices that would make us happy and proud of who we were, not care what other people thought, and enjoy life to its fullest. Life is more than just these four walls, Mr. Dawkin would say. My experience with him encouraged me to stay curious about people. They will surprise and delight you in the best ways. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Sabrina. And of course, shout out to Mr. and Mrs. Dawkin. After the break, more on the lasting bonds between teachers and students. And listeners, we will love to hear about your favorite teacher. Leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're reflecting on the importance of teachers. Still with me is Sarah Ruhl. Sarah's the author of the new book, Lessons from My Teachers. Sarah's also a playwright, 2-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, a Tony Award nominee, and the recipient of the MacArthur Genius Foundation Fellowship. And her play, Eurydice, is running right now at Signature Theater. So, Sarah, I know you prepared to read an excerpt from your book. Would love to hear what portion you chose.
Sure, this is just a little section from the introduction where I'm talking about the impetus for writing the book and going through a sort of dark period and coming out of it. Um, okay. In the daylight, I wanted to return to my roots for ballast and support, to the real human lessons my teachers had already taught me. I wanted their voices in my head. That I've absorbed guidance from all kinds of real people and places seems an obvious thing to say, and yet, one irony of our digital age, in which we desperately try to learn from YouTube, is that our phones can give us facts but not story, information but not relation. And yet, I believe passionately that one of the main lessons teachers can give us is their singular presence, the nimble strength of connection. The great teachers are often those whose teachings cannot be done to scale, whose lessons depend on specificity of place, time, and relation. In other words, a teaching that is truly absorbed is composed not of words only, but also of the example of the person doing the teaching. The lesson received is often a how rather than a what, because the word is passed through an embodied person, more relation than idiom, more connection than mnemonic device. The teachers who have most affected me have modeled how to be in relationship rather than simply transmitting reducible content. And so, this is a book about many of the teachers I was lucky enough to have had over the course of my life. It is, in a way, a portrait of my life told through portraits of my teachers. Sometimes I found my teachers in the classroom proper, other times in books, dreams, the natural world, the theater. I hope to continue to orient myself as a student in this world. The more I teach, the more I learn, and the more I see teachers all around me. I'm grateful for the process of writing this book because it led me back to my teachers, and I dedicate it to all of them, the living and the dead.
Well, and actually building up to that dedication, if you could say one thing to all the teachers who are quietly shaping lives every day, what would it be?
It would be thank you and keep going. That's it.
Short and sweet, but very powerful. And we kind of talked about earlier too, hoping readers will seek connection after reading the book. Is there anything else that you hope that they would get out from the book or even from this conversation?
Well, one thing I noticed in some conversations with friends and family after writing the book, when I asked them about teachers who'd affected them, one thing I did learn was there were a couple friends I had or family members I had who didn't feel they'd had a teacher who they were close with.
Mm.
And they were reflecting that it takes a certain amount of vulnerability and bravery to sort of raise your hand as a student or someone who wants to be mentored in a more profound way. And so I guess in addition to thanking teachers, I would say raise your hand and look for a teacher. That could mean you already are a student, but you want more teaching from a particular teacher. Or it could mean that you're 50 and looking for an art teacher, or 80 and looking for a meditation teacher. But that sometimes the pursuit of a teacher requires some bravery and putting yourself out there to find the right person to teach you.
And before we go and before our final question, I do want to share one more story about a special teacher from a Connecticut public colleague. This is from Megan Fitzgerald, who is our senior manager of projects and radio programming. She said, Phyllis Muldoon was one of my high school English teachers. She was amazing. She was funny, and you could tell that she could see the beauty in the mundane and find it in tragedy. She always pushed me in my writing. She knew when I was phoning it in, and I'm forever grateful for those pushes. She taught me that our ability to create our own stories and tap into our creativity is accessible to us at any time. We just need to learn to sit with it and to be authentic. I once submitted a story to her. I swiped a line from the lyrics of a song, which then became popular at the time. She knew it. She asked me, and I tried to pretend that I must have picked it up subconsciously. But she knew it, but she didn't shame me. I have a journal of poems she helped critique for me that to this day still has all of her sticky notes in it. I look back through them from time to time when I have trouble assessing my internal cheering squad because I know deep down Ms. Muldoon is still there, cheering me on, even if it's with some tough love. Well, thank you so much, Megan, for sharing that story with us. I think it's pretty amazing to hear that even in this small space, there are so many teachers that have had such profound impacts on us. And Sarah, before we close out the show, we'd love to get your thoughts on, any tips, or maybe not tips, but just thoughts on how can we become better teachers or better students?
Well, I think the listening that we talked about earlier on is deeply important. And the showing up for your students, the showing up for your teachers, the staying connected, the staying in touch, and the reminder that the classroom does not define um, the teacher-student relationship. I mean, sometimes it begins there, but hopefully the bond carries on long after the classroom walls disappear.
You've been listening to Sarah Ruhl, who's the author of the new book, Lessons from My Teachers. We'll link it to our show page, but I also encourage you to venture out to your local bookstore and, you'll likely run into a teacher there. Sarah, it's been great talking to you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Such a delight. Thank you for having me.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Wynn. It was edited by Robin Doyon-Aiken. Our technical producer is Jean Amatruda. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening, and happy reading and happy active listening, everyone.